what we're going to learn. Sorry, one second, just get the recording going. Okay, so just a sec. Right, so as I say, there's quite a lot to get through today, so let's get straight down to it. We're going to be doing a siyum. The Rebbe does a siyum on the Gemara Shabbos. And so he begins by quoting a Mishna right at the end, the final Mishna in the Gemara. We're going to have a little bit of background to understand what's going on in this Mishna. The Rebbe will then analyze how the Mishna speaks about these three issues that relate to Shabbos. The issue of closing up an open area, and we'll see exactly what that means, measuring and tying knots on Shabbos. So these are the three things that relate to this particular Mishnah. The Mishnah begins with a story, so we'll have to start with that story. So basically the story says there's certain things you're allowed to do on Shabbos, or poikin asamor, moedin asamatas, moedin asamikveh, which is that you're allowed to block up a window. That's poikin asamor, you're allowed to block up a window, and you're allowed to measure certain things. We're going to focus on the story that the Mishnah tells. So there was a story that happened in the time of these two individuals. And basically what the story is, the Gemara gives us an insight into the story. They were sitting on Shabbos inside their house. The house adjoined a little narrow alleyway. The alleyway had some kind of a roof over it that covered from the one house to the next house on the other side of the alleyway. In the middle of this roof, for one reason or another, there was a piece that had cracked open. And there was a dead body lying underneath this roof in the alleyway. Now what they're concerned about is they're concerned about the laws of tumah, of impurity. And the concern is that tumah, impurity, particularly the impurity of a dead body, can be transmitted from one area to another area if there are two considerations. The first consideration is if there is a roof. It's what we call oihel. So if there's a roof over the dead body, anything else that is under that roof is contaminated by the tumah, the impurity of the dead body. The second consideration is if there's an opening between one room and another room that are under the same roof. So if that opening is larger than a certain size, then the tumah will transmit from the one area into the other area, and the people sitting inside the house would be impure. But there is an escape hatch. The escape hatch is that let's say the dead body is directly underneath an opening. So for example, they would often have like a sunroof, a skylight. So let's say that there's a skylight in the roof, and the dead body is directly underneath the skylight. Then we'll say that it is not under the oihel, it is not under the same covering. And so as a result of that, it does not transmit impurity to whoever is under the cover. So now the rabbis have two questions that they need to determine. The one is, let's try and block the window so that the tumah cannot enter into our house. The other is the crack in the roof that was over this alleyway that had a crack in it. Is the crack large enough that it could separate where the corpse lies from the rest of the covered area so that the corpse would not contaminate the covered area? Okay, so these are the things that these rabbis needed to work out on Shabbos. So what did they do? The first thing they did is shepakuku es hamoor batofiach. They took an earthenware vessel and they put it into the opening of the window to block up the window so it would not have the correct size of opening to allow this impurity to enter. That's the first thing they did. They blocked up, they closed up an opening, a window. Second thing that they did, v'koshru es hamekida begemi. Then they tied, gemi is like a kind of a reed. So they tied around an earthenware vessel, they tied some gemi, they tied some of this reed, later to try and work out im yesh bagigis poseach tefach im lav. If the crack in the ceiling was wide enough to be considered a tefach big, so they must have suspended this piece of earthenware to kind of pendulum it to see the size of the opening of the crack of the roof above the dead body to work out if it's more than a tefach wide, in which case, if it is more than a tefach wide, the dead body would no longer be considered under the cover, and so anything that's under the cover would be excluded from impurity. So the Mishnah concludes, from the way that they tell the story, we learn the following three laws. Shepoikekin, that it is permissible to block up a window on Shabbos. Umoidedin, it is permissible to make measurements on Shabbos. V'koishrin b'Shabbos, and it is permissible to tie on Shabbos. And we'll have to analyze all of these three. So what we're going to actually focus on, interestingly, in this Mishnah is the order. The order of how these three laws are told in this phrase. Poikekin, you're allowed to block up a window. That's the first thing on the list. Moidedin, that you're allowed to measure things, second on the list. V'koishin, and you're allowed to tie things. Now, the reason we're asking this question is because firstly, we've got to see under what circumstances are you allowed to do these three things. Is it carte blanche? Are you always allowed to measure? Are you always allowed to tie? Are you always allowed to block up a window? Second question we have to ask is there a sense of priority over here in the way that these three are listed? So let's first look at the first point. Under what circumstances are you allowed to do it? So firstly, measurement, the Gemara tackles directly. And the Gemara tells us, Eima, the Amri Rabbanon Medida, the mitzvah. The Gemara is absolutely clear that the only time when you are allowed to make a measurement on Shabbos is for the purpose of a mitzvah. So for example, you can measure that there's enough water inside a mikveh. That's permissible on Shabbos. Okay? So Medida, measurement, only for a mitzvah. Tosfos tells us, however, Tosfos commenting on the same Gemara tells us, Bifkika lo ba'inan shel mitzvah. To be able to block up a window on Shabbos does not require a mitzvah. It could just simply be that you're cold and you've got this open window, so you're allowed to take a board and stick it in the window in order to prevent the cold air from coming in. Nothing at all associated with a mitzvah. And that would be acceptable. So that's important for us because we're now seeing that there's a distinction in how the halacha is applied. And then we see in Shulchan Aruch, B'chol kesher she'eino shel kayama, any knot that is not going to be permanent. In koshrei kesher uman, harei ze asur. You're still not allowed to tie a knot, even if it is not going to be permanent, as long as it is ma'aser uman, which means a professional knot. But letzorech mitzvah, it's allowed. So what do we see? There are three things listed over here. There's on Shabbos, you're allowed to measure, but only on condition that it's for a mitzvah. You're allowed to tie as long as it's not a permanent knot, even if it's a proper knot, as long as it's for a mitzvah. And you're allowed to put something into the window to block it, even if it is not for a mitzvah. Now, it's important to classify that because this will speak to our question about the order in which the Mishnah tells us these three things. Because the most logical way to have told us the three laws would have been in the same order that the story happened. So the story was, first they blocked the window. Okay, so the first law we learned is that you're allowed to block a window. The second law that we learned was that they tied. And then we learned that they measured, right? So let's go back. So what did it say? So what they did was they tied the thing, and then they measured if it had poseach tefach. They then measured using this tied reed and piece of earthenware. They then measured with that poseach tefach. So the order of the story was blocked the window, then they tied, then they measured. However, the Mishnah concludes that tells us we learned three laws from this. First law, that you're allowed to block a window. Second law, that you're allowed to measure. And the third law, that you're allowed to tie. So that's strange for us. Why is it that the Mishnah tells us practically what the laws are in a different order to how they were actually presented in the story? That's what we've got to work out. Okay? So it can't just be that it's listing things in the order of the story, because then tying should have come first. So perhaps this is why. We have a principle, and this is just one example of it, but we have a principle that often appears in Gemara. The principle is called Loi Zoi Af Zoi, which basically means that when we list a series of mitzvahs, often, or series of laws, often the Gemara will first list the one that is the most surprising, and then it will say, not only can you do something so surprising, but you can obviously also do things which are less surprising. So here's the example, one of the examples. The Gemara in Kiddushin talks about the fact that a person is not only capable of marrying a woman by himself, giving her something of monetary value like a ring, but he's even permitted to appoint a shliach, which is more surprising. It's more surprising that he is allowed to ask somebody else to marry a woman on his behalf. So Tosfos comments on that. Ha'ish mekadesh, says Tosfos, hashta bishluchoi mekadesh, considering that the Gemara has already told me that he can have somebody else mekadesh, so-called betroth the woman on his behalf. Boy mi boye. So you have to tell me now that he could do it himself. Surely it should be self-explanatory. If another third party is capable of betrothing a woman on someone's behalf, surely they themselves can do it. So in this Tosfos he introduces this point. So here he introduces this principle that sometimes that's the language of Gemara. Not only this case, but even this case as well. In other words, we start first with a surprising case, and then we say the less surprising case. And then Tosfos explains why that would not be a sufficient answer in the case of Kiddushin, but we're not learning the Gemara in Kiddushin. We're learning Shabbos. So maybe that's what it's telling us. Look, you know what's surprising? What's surprising is that you can block up a window even if it's not for the purpose of the mitzvah. That's why that one is mentioned first, because we first tackle the most surprising law. Then you have two laws which are a little bit more understandable. Oh, you can measure or tie for the purpose of a mitzvah. Okay, so we get that. For the purpose of the mitzvah, we understand that there is room to be perhaps a little bit more lenient. This will not at face value explain to us, though, the order. That only explains to us why poikekin, closing up, blocking up the window, goes first, because it's the most surprising. But there's still nothing yet that tells us why we should have put first measuring and then tying. Firstly, the story did not happen that way, and on the face of it, there's nothing more surprising about the case that you're allowed to measure on Shabbos than that you're allowed to tie on Shabbos. So why is it that the one precedes the other? Just to explain this a little bit better, we have to understand what is the rationale why you're not allowed to measure on Shabbos, and what is the rationale why you're not allowed to tie something on Shabbos. So let's just be clear. Kesher shel kayama, if you tie a permanent knot, that is a Torah prohibition. This is not what we're discussing over here. We're discussing tying a knot that is not permanent, but is professional, which you're normally not allowed to do. And the Mishna here is telling us that if it's for the purpose of a mitzvah, you are allowed to do. Which means measuring on Shabbos is not outlawed, it's not forbidden by Torah, it's something rabbinic. And tying a professional knot that is not permanent is rabbinic. So we need to understand the logic. Why did the rabbis tell us we may not measure something on Shabbos? And why did the rabbis tell us that we may not do a temporary yet professional knot on Shabbos? Now, these two pieces of information are going to be critical for us, because once we understand the halachic difference between the approach to measurement and the approach to knots, it will help us understand a lot of the nature of this Mishnah and how it all works. So let's talk first about measurement. The Shulchan Aruch, we're quoting here from the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, Asur limdoid shum davar b'Shabbos. A person is not permitted to measure anything on Shabbos. Bein beyad, whether you measure it by hand, or I suppose as we might do today when you pace out a distance. So you may not measure something even using your hand as a tefach and saying 1 fist, 2 fists, 3 fists. Bein bechevel, or if you use a rope as a measurement. So you know that the rope is X amount long, and so you measure using the rope. Either way, you're not allowed to do it. Why not? So we got to commit this to memory for the rest of this sikha. Why are we not allowed to measure on Shabbos? because it is a mundane activity and therefore it degrades Shabbos. Okay, so let's be clear. The prohibition, the rabbinic prohibition against measuring something on Shabbos is because it is disrespectful to Shabbos to do a weekday-like activity on Shabbos. Why are you not allowed to tie a non-permanent professional knot? Also in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. So to tie properly, a proper kesher shel kayama, a real permanent knot, is a Torah law. As far as the Torah is concerned, you only transgress if the knot that you have tied is a knot that will last forever. Which means, dahainu, shekoishrei al da shishor kain kolzman she'efshar lo liyos kayam, which means that the person's intention when they tie the knot is that it will stay tied as long as it's physically possible for it to remain tied. I have no intention of untying it. That's the Torah prohibition. When I tie a knot that I have no intention to untie. But if a person decides in their own mind, I want this knot to be tied for X amount of time, and is definitely you will definitely undo the knot at that particular point. Even if it's going to be an exceptionally long time until I reach there, that is not considered the prohibition of tying a knot as far as the Torah is concerned. Therefore, and therefore you would not be liable if you tied such a knot or if you untied such a knot from the Torah's perspective. But from a rabbinic perspective, it is also considered a permanent knot. Why? Because we anticipate that it is going to remain tied for a period of time. So it is similar to a real knot. Again, why may I not measure something on Shabbos? Because it's disrespectful to Shabbos. Why may I not tie a professional knot even for a so-called short period of time? Because it is like a real knot. Now, if you follow that logic, it would sound like kesher, tying a knot, should come first on the list in our Mishnah. Why? Because the Mishnah should list things in order of how surprising it is that we're allowed to do it. So it's surprising that I can block up the window even if there's no mitzvah involved. It's surprising when it comes to a mitzvah that I can tie a knot, because a knot looks like a Torah prohibition. So it's surprising that just because it's temporary, I'm now allowed to do it for a mitzvah. Whereas to measure isn't actually transgressing Shabbos. It doesn't seem similar to a real transgression from the Torah. It is only because we're concerned that it's disregard for Shabbos, least likely for us to be surprised that you are allowed to do it for a mitzvah. So we're still at our point where we want to know, why does the Mishnah list them in what appears to be the illogical order? First telling us about blocking a window, then telling us that you're allowed to measure something for a mitzvah, and then telling us that you're allowed to tie something for a mitzvah. So to understand this is the final Mishnah of the tractate, the Masechta Shabbos. We're going to go back to the first Mishnah in Shabbos. The beginning and end of any section of Torah always has a connection and relationship between it. So we're going to go back to the beginning of Shabbos, where we will learn a different halacha. Based on that halacha, it's a very well-known halacha. Based on that halacha, we will have a different perspective on what the issues that we're actually discussing might well be. So what's the first Mishnah that it says in Shabbos? Very famously is this Mishnah about hoitza'ah, about carrying something out of a private domain into a public domain, from a reshus hayachid into reshus harabim. And the Mishnah there very, very famously gives the example of a poor man who's standing outside and a rich man who's standing inside, and all the various permutations. So it says, Yitzios HaShabbos Shtayim Shehein Arba. There are two scenarios, rich man inside, poor man outside, and four possible manifestations of how it works. And one of the things that we learn very clearly in that Mishnah as the Shulchan Aruch tells us, Min ha-Torah ein echaya v'lekeshe oiker chayfetz mirshus hayachid v'nichoi birshus harabim oy ifcha. It's absolutely clear that in order to break Shabbos by transferring something from a private to a public domain, or from a public to a private domain, the person has to do two things in order to transgress, to break Shabbos. Number one, and it says over here, keshe oiker, he has to do what is called akira. So the person has to pick up the item from the terrain, from the ground, from the area of, let's call it the Rishus HaYachid, the private domain. He has to then transfer it into the public domain, and then Hanocha, he has to put it down in the public domain. Akira without Hanocha, if the person only picks it up, but is not the person who puts it down in the other domain, he does not violate Shabbos from a Torah perspective, or vice versa. If, like the poor man who's standing outside over there, sticks his hand into the private domain, and the rich man who does the Akira, he picks up the bread and he puts it into the poor man's hand, and the poor man is now the one who places it into the public area. So neither of them has violated Shabbos from a Torah point of view, because from a Torah point of view, you only violate Shabbos in the case of transfer, hoitza'ah, taking something from one rishus, one domain, to another rishus, only if you do both steps. The removal from the one domain and the placement in the other domain. Now this is a very well-known law in Shabbos. Most of us are familiar with it. What we may not be familiar with is that there's a very strong question on this law of Shabbos. Why, in fact, is the person not liable? And you'll see why it's such a big question. Because we have a principle that the Gemara tells us in Yuma. I'm not going to read the whole Gemara to you, but basically the Gemara in Yuma tells us that if a person eats on Yom Kippur, there's a certain shiur, there's a certain amount of food that you have to eat in order to violate Yom Kippur. So if a person eats intentionally the amount of food that forms that shiur, that measurement on Yom Kippur, that person is chayav kares. That person has the spiritual punishment of being cut off from Hashem. If a person eats half or a fraction of the shiur, they are not liable for punishment. But it is still forbidden. It is still considered a sin. So, in other words, we learn in Yuma that if a person only does chatzi shiur, part of the full amount of what is considered violating a law of Torah, although they cannot be punished for what they've done, they still have sinned. So the question is then asked with regards to Shabbos. The shiur, the measurement of breaking Shabbos by transferring something from one domain to another domain is lifting, in other words, removing it from domain A, call it the private domain, plus placing it in domain B, which would then be the public domain. The shiur, the measurement of breaking Shabbos, is you have to do both parts. Then a person can be liable for punishment. So if they were, for example, warned by witnesses and taken in front of a beis din, they could actually be executed, liable for punishment. However, the Gemara says clearly in Yuma that if a person does chatzi shiur, let's say he only lifts it up without placing it down in the next domain. So the rich man only takes the bread out of his kitchen and he puts it into the hand of the poor man. He doesn't put it into the public area. The poor man is the one who takes it into the public area, and he hasn't done the akira. He hasn't picked it up off the property of the Rishus HaYachid, the private domain. So neither of them is liable for punishment because neither of them has done the full shiur, the full measurement of breaking Shabbos. However, chatzi shiur, surely they've done part of the measurement, and for part of the measurement you should be considered to have sinned. We can't punish you for the sin, but it should be considered a sin. Why then does the Mishna say that the person is patur, exempt from sin? It's a very interesting question. And the answer to that question is actually quite simple. We have to distinguish between chatzi shiur and chatzi melacha. So let's say, for argument's sake, that a person eats on Yom Kippur. And we say that in order to violate Yom Kippur, a person has to have the volume called a kazayas. So this person only eats half a kazayas. Well, kazayas is a measurement, and they haven't eaten the full measurement, so therefore they are not liable for punishment, but they have eaten, so therefore they have sinned. The melacha, the action of eating, happens whether you eat a lot or you eat a little. It doesn't matter. It's just that for the sake of punishment, the shear of eating has to reach a certain threshold in order to be punishable. But the action of eating begins from the first morsel that goes into a person's mouth. Therefore, it is a sin from the first morsel, because that is considered the melacha, the action. Transferring an item from point A to point B, the melacha, the concept, the action is to transfer from point A to point B. So if you only get halfway, you've done none of the action. This is not a question of how much shear, how much legal measurement is applied to the scenario. This is a question of how much of the action was done. So my goal was to take this piece of bread out of my house and get it into the public domain, which happens to be the hand of the poor person. But if all I did was to put it into the poor man's hand while his hand was still in my house, I have not done the melacha. I haven't done the action. The action requires 2 steps. And so it's really important for us to be able to distinguish between something where there's a full action and a partial measurement versus something that is a partial action. So with that alone, with that concept, let's come back to talk about tying a knot. So if tying a knot on Shabbos is the melacha, as the Torah considers it, the melacha, the action of tying a knot that is forbidden from the Torah, is kesher shel kayama, a knot that will be tied indefinitely. I have no intention to ever untie it. If that's the case, then if a person ties a knot, even if it's a professional knot, but their intention is clearly to untie it, even if it's in 10 years' time, that is not half a shear. It's not that the measurement of how long a knot has to be tied is indefinite. And here, the measurement of time is 10 years. No, the melacha, the definition of the activity of tying a knot that is forbidden on Shabbos, is the activity of tying a knot indefinitely. The minute you tie a knot with any kind of finite time period, it is no longer that melacha. It is not considered part of that melacha. Okay? So that's possibly how we can now distinguish why it is that the Mishnah says first poikekin, then moededin, then koishrin. Because maybe what it's telling us is when you fill up the window, you're doing a full melacha. The whole melacha filling the window. When you measure, you're doing the full experience of measuring, regardless of whether it's a violation of Shabbos or just disrespectful to Shabbos. But when you're tying a professional knot for a short-term period, you're not doing the actual melacha. So it's more reasonable to excuse it in the case of a mitzvah. That's what you'd think. There's just one problem. Sorry, go ahead. Question. So you cannot say, no, there's no shear when it comes to the knot. In other words, let's say for argument's sake that a sailor's knot is different to, let's say, a tradesman's knot, let's just say. So you're not going to say, well, if I do this kind of knot, but it actually is a better knot, like the sailor's knot is a better knot, so I'm doing half the shear because I'm doing a lesser knot. There's no such concept. As far as the Torah is concerned, the definition of a knot, as far as the Torah is concerned, is not the design, it's not the style, it's not how tight it's going to be. It's simply the fact that it's tied with the intention of never being untied. You can't have a half an intention of that. It's not a measurement of time. That's the thing. It's not a measurement of time. So there are 2 options. The one option is time is not a factor. This knot will be quote unquote forever. That's the shear, the measurement of the melacha of Shabbos. There's a different category which is called a knot that is intended for a period of time, in which case how long that time is completely irrelevant. Okay. Correct. The measurement is the intention. Exactly. The measurement for a knot is the intention with which you tied it in the first place, which is really interesting. It's an interesting kind of measurement. Okay, but this is a problem. I'll tell you why it's a problem. Why is it a problem? Because now we've said that if it's chatzi melacha, in other words, if you're not actually doing the full activity, it's more likely to allow it on Shabbos in the case of a mitzvah, then logically, we've now said tying a knot is similar to only doing an akira without an hanocha, only lifting the item without putting it down. And if you're telling me that to tie a knot which is not shel kayama is allowed in the case of a mitzvah, then surely I'm allowed to take bread from my kitchen and put it into the poor man's house, the poor man's hand, when his hand is inside my property, because I'm only doing half the melacha. I should be able to do it for the case of a mitzvah. Now, all the Meforshim say that that's not the case, and in fact, on the contrary, look, for example, at Bar Tanura, he says, it deliberately in the Mishnah uses the example of a poor man and a rich man, the mitzvah haba ba'avera asura v'chayovin aleha, that you're not allowed to use the mitzvah as an excuse. The fact that you're doing a mitzvah, you're helping a poor man, you're giving him bread, you might think that that would allow you to be able to do it on Shabbos, seeing as you're only doing part of the melacha, not the full melacha. You're only doing half of the experience, lifting it out of the Rishus HaYachid. You might think that a mitzvah allows it. Clearly, the Mishnah told us the example of poor and rich to highlight that a mitzvah is not a good enough reason why you should be allowed to do half a melacha. So we cannot argue that the reason kesher is allowed, tying a knot, is allowed on Shabbos is because it's half melacha, and half melacha is permitted in the case of a mitzvah. So we're not satisfied with that. It means we have to go back to our original comparison between the rationale for measurement versus the rationale for tying a knot. Our question is, why does the Mishnah put measurement first, as if it's the more surprising case, before tying a knot, which is for some reason less surprising? We thought we could answer it by saying, well, because tying is not even the real melacha in the first place. We're saying that can't be the answer, because it's evident from the first Mishnah in Shabbos that the fact that something is not a complete melacha is not an excuse to be allowed to do it for a mitzvah. So back to square one, why does the Mishnah feel that measurement is more surprising than tying a knot, and therefore has to be put first? So, the Rambam tells us, Nemar ba'Torah tishbois. The Torah tells us that you have to rest on Shabbos. Afilu midvarim she'einon melacha chayav lishbois mehen. In addition to those 39 categories of melacha that are outright forbidden on Shabbos, in addition to that, there are certain things that we have to rest or desist from, what we call shvus, even though they're not forbidden by Torah. There are many things that the Torah says we are not allowed to do because they are a shvus. Some of them are forbidden because they are similar to an outright forbidden activity that the Torah forbids, like tying a knot. Why are you not allowed to tie a knot that is not permanent? Because it is similar to kesher shel kayama. It looks similar. I don't know your intention. I don't know how long you plan to have this knot for. I look at the knot that you've tied, and to me it looks like a kesher shel kayama. That's category one kind of rabbinic prohibition. Don't do something because it looks like a Torah transgression. And then there are other things that you're not allowed to do, because maybe if you do this, it will lead you to believe that you could do something else. Like, for example, if you are allowed to hold a pen, maybe you'll believe that you can write. Okay, so writing itself is already associated with a different mitzvah. So let's say, for argument's sake, if you can hold a candle, maybe you'll light a new fire, for example. So there are two possibilities why it is that you're not allowed to do a rabbinic prohibition, either because it is too similar to an existing prohibition or because it could lead to a different prohibition. Okay, so what's the problem with carrying on Shabbos? Why do we say that you're not allowed to hand the bread to the poor man even if his hand is inside your property on Shabbos, even though it's not a full melacha and even though it's for the sake of mitzvah? Why? Because if we allow you to do that, the next time the poor man comes, you'll put your hand out the gate and you'll put it into his hand, and it's devarim sheyava mehen isa skila. It might, if we allow the one kind of conduct, it will allow people, or it will lead people to believe that the fully forbidden conduct is also okay. Get that? So in other words, the poor man sticks his hand inside my house. That means when I put the bread inside his hand, I have not violated Shabbos. I haven't even done the melacha properly, because the melacha requires 2 steps, and I've only done 1 step. Why do the rabbis still say I'm not allowed to do it, even though it's for the sake of a mitzvah? Because it falls into the category of, if you do this, it's likely that you'll later, next time around, actually break a Torah law. This is different to tying a knot. Tying a knot, it's not because I tied it now, next time I'm going to tie it permanently. The only reason it was forbidden in the first place is because tying a knot does not count as breaking Shabbos, unless the original intention was to be permanent. So it's in the category of things you're not allowed to do because they are doimin, because they are similar to things that are forbidden. Therefore, we cannot use the comparison between the first Mishnah of handing something to a poor person and this Mishnah about tying a knot, because they're actually in different categories. So that's how we're going to answer it. The only problem is, and I'm sure this is on your mind right now, whoa, hang on a second. How on earth can you tell? Yes, you're right, you can't compare the two, but on the contrary, if a person's going to break Shabbos by giving bread to the poor man, that means he has to actually do a different action. Surely you could be conscious of the fact that this kind of action is okay and that kind of action is not okay. Whereas tying a knot, we said, is only a difference in intention. If you're going to allow me to tie this kind of knot with one intention, surely it's easy for me to tie the same kind of knot with a different intention. So surely there's a very good reason to tell us that you may not tie a knot that is professional, even in the short term, even for the sake of a mitzvah. Which means it should be more surprising to us that you're allowed to tie a knot on Shabbos. And that means that the Mishnah should have put it first before the case of the measurement, which is less surprising to us. So, okay, so let's just move beyond that. Here, we're going to go to this point. So in order to understand it, you have to know this. Why do you tie a knot? What is the purpose of tying a knot? If you want to understand any issue in halacha, you have to get to the core of what the action is, or what the meaning of that action is. Why do you tie a knot? The purpose of tying a knot is that here's one piece of string and here's another piece of string. And this piece of string and this piece of string are separate from each other. My goal in tying them is to make them one. That's my goal. I want to make them one. If my intention is to make them one forever, that's called tying a knot. But if I just want to tie them for a little bit of time because I need to close a bottle or connect something or whatever, I have to tie my shoelaces. But my intention is that I have to take off my shoes later, so I'm going to untie the knot. That tells you that even now that it is tied, my intention is never to make them one. For example, like we see in the Mishna in Parah, Hamayim amechazvin psulin. And when it comes to the water that you have to use for the Parah Aduma, for the ritual of the red heifer, where it says it has to be mayim chayim, it has to be living water. So there the Mishnah says, if it's false water, mayim amechazvin, false water, then it's not kosher for the Parah Aduma. So the Mishnah asks, what does it mean, false water? What does that mean? If it's a river that dries up or a spring that dries up once in 7 years, then even now as it flows, it's not considered flowing. In other words, we have a principle in Torah, in halacha, that says if something later is going to change, if something later is going to lose its current status, then even now it's not considered to have that status. This is the clue, this is the concept, this is the idea of a knot. If I'm talking about carrying something from inside my house into the street, it's one action with a bunch of segments. Segment 1 is picking up the item. Segment 2 is walking out my door. Segment 3 is putting it down on the ground. So I need segments 1 and 3 in order to complete the process and to violate Shabbos. Tying a knot, on the other hand, tying a knot has nothing to do with segments. Tying a knot, if it's the intention, if the objective is not to bring these two things, to make them one. To make them one means forever, as far as I'm concerned. Things outside of my control might change that, but as far as I'm concerned, they're going to be one. If that intention is not fulfilled, if my intention is not to make them one, it's just to temporarily tie these two things together, that is not considered a real violation of Shabbos, and therefore if I need to be able to do it for a mitzvah, I am permitted to do so. Now we can finally understand the order of the Mishnah. Poikekin, biggest surprise. Poikekin, I'm allowed to do something which should be prohibited, but I'm allowed to do it on Shabbos, even though it looks like binyan, it looks like construction, and I'm not allowed to construct on Shabbos. I'm allowed to fill the gap in the window on Shabbos, even if it's not for a mitzvah. Most surprising, it's not for a mitzvah, and it appears similar to a real transgression from the Torah, and yet I'm allowed to do it. Moidedin, not only that, I'm allowed to do something that is an actual action. When I measure, that is a real action. It's just that it shouldn't be done on Shabbos because it's disrespectful to Shabbos. So it's surprising to me that I'm allowed to do something which is a real action as long as it's for the sake of a mitzvah. So suddenly I'm no longer degrading Shabbos because it's for the sake of a mitzvah. Koishrin, tying a professional knot that is not a long-term knot, that is less surprising to me because it's not a real action. It was never intended to be something lasting. If it's not intended to be lasting, then even now, as those two strings, those two laces are tied together, even at this moment, they're actually not considered to be tied together. And therefore, I can understand why it's, so to speak, the least surprising or the least radical of the three halachas. So what can that teach us? Poikekin, even if it's not for a mitzvah. Moidedin, even though it's a ma'aseh chol, it's an action, I'm still allowed to do it for a mitzvah. Koishrin, it's only similar to a malacha, it's not a real action, least surprising of the lot. These three things speak to the heart of the spirituality of Shabbos. Shabbos has three major components to it. Friday evening, Shabbos day, Shabbos afternoon, what we call Raiva deriving. Shabbos afternoon, the period between Mincha and Ma'ariv, it's called the highest, most spiritual level of Shabbos. As Shabbos enters, we're told that Malchus, which is the lowest energy that Hashem invests into the world and which runs the world during the week, Malchus is elevated as Shabbos comes in. That's the first stage of the spirituality of Shabbos. Meaning to say, we talk about Malchus. Malchus is what's called Malchus of Atzilus, the lowest level of the highest spiritual world, which during the week extends down into the lower worlds, Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya. So what happens as Shabbos comes in is Malchus, the energy that runs our spiritual world, and our physical world is elevated to a higher consciousness and a deeper connection to Hashem. During the day of Shabbos, Zoh, which is a dimension of that realm of Atzilus itself, is revealed and more exposed, and we kind of have this greater spirituality and holiness more than any other time of the week. Shabbos afternoon, there's such a high dimension of godliness that is revealed that it actually brings together Zoh and Malchus. Zoh is a dimension of godliness that is generally beyond the world. Malchus is the energy of godliness that is invested in the world. They are complete opposites. So to bring them together means I have to have a higher, more powerful dimension of godliness, which is revealed in that last period of Shabbos. This is alluded to in our davening. On Friday night we say V'yanuchu Va. Va is a feminine word. That relates to Malchus, which is a feminine energy. Shabbos day we say V'yanuchu Boy, which is a masculine word. That relates to Zah, which is revealed during Shabbos day, which is a masculine energy. And Mincha we say V'yanuchu Vam, which is a plural word, because that relates to the fact that there is this combination and harmony of these two different energies that come together at that time of Shabbos. This is what the Mishnah alludes to on a spiritual level. When Shabbos comes in, Poikekin, we're told, the Gemara says, that Ruach Tzefonis, the northern direction, is open. What does it mean, open? It means that it's exposed to negativity. So at this time of the year, for example, we have the prophecy that says, Mitzafon tiposach hara'ah. All evil against Israel always comes from the north. North is exposed and is susceptible to impurity. So therefore, as we are during the week, we're always exposed to impurity. We have the possibility of sin. We have the possibility of negativity. When Shabbos comes in, poikekin, that exposure gets blocked. Why? Because Malchus, the energy that runs the world, is elevated to a higher spiritual consciousness. And as we read on a Friday night in the Chabad custom, that this is the time where Hashem removes all the negative elements from the world. He blocks up the top window. He blocks up the north. He blocks up the exposure to negativity. Moededin. Shabbos day, not only does he block out the negative, on Shabbos day he reveals to us Zoh. Another way to describe Zoh is what's called midos of Atzilus, the characteristics / measurements of Atzilus, moededin. That's the measurement that happens next on Shabbos. What does it mean, measurement? The exposure of the midos elyonos, of the higher measurements, higher dimensions of godliness that seep into our world. That happens in the next phase of Shabbos. And the final phase of Shabbos is koishin. What's to tie? To bring two separate things together. The ultimate experience of Shabbos is to take Zoh, Malchus, two completely disparate spiritual entities, and bring them together into harmony. So in addition to the fact that the order in the Mishnah is taka, halachically, from the most surprising, something which you're allowed to do even not for a mitzvah, into the less surprising, something which is really similar to actually breaking Shabbos, but is allowed, which is really degrading of Shabbos, but is allowed in the case of a mitzvah, to the least surprising, something which is not even a malacha, and therefore is allowed for a mitzvah. In spiritual terms, this relates to the three dimensions of what happens on Shabbos. First, Hashem blocks out the negative. Then Hashem reveals the midos of holiness. And then Hashem takes us to a point where we can actually reconcile the reality of the week, represented by Malchus, with the spirituality of Shabbos, represented by Zoh, so that as we go into the new week, we are empowered not to be trapped by the susceptibility to negative, not to be trapped by the Ruach Tzefonis, the so-called northern window that is always open, but to be able to harmonize holiness into our day-by-day activities, which we should, please God, be able to do every single day of the week.